There is a growing number of people who claim that the numbers preserved in the Greek Septuagint are the correct figures, whereas the Hebrew Masoretic Text underwent a deliberate 1,250-year chronological reduction by the rabbinic leaders in the 2nd century AD. Is this true, or is this a complete distortion of the facts? Hello everyone, and welcome back to our video series on important Bible topics. And today we want to discuss numbers or amounts in the Greek Septuagint version of the Bible. And over the years, many people have contacted us with questions regarding the Greek Septuagint versus Hebrew Masoretic Text. Which version is more reliable? Which version should we follow? Which version can be trusted more? And also, which chronology is more accurate? Because there's a massive difference in the biblical chronology if you compare the Hebrew Bible with the Greek Septuagint. So today we want to investigate this very important question. First of all, the Greek Septuagint, also known as the LXX, is the mainstream Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament, whereas the Hebrew Masoretic Text, also known as the MT, is the mainstream Hebrew version of the Hebrew Old Testament. And there's a common misconception where people claim that the Greek Septuagint is much older than the Hebrew Bible. How is that possible? Well, they say, look, the Septuagint was translated in the 3rd century BCE, whereas the Hebrew Masoretic manuscripts are mostly from the 10th century CE and later. So then the Greek Bible is supposedly much older than the Hebrew Bible. However, this is a complete misrepresentation because in the first place, everyone agrees that when the Septuagint was translated, possibly only the Torah in the 3rd century BCE, and the other books followed later, but everyone agrees that the Septuagint was translated from Hebrew. So it's a well-known fact that the Hebrew Bible preceded the translation thereof into Greek. And by the way, there is no surviving Greek manuscript of the Septuagint from the 3rd century BCE. So let's rather look at this honest and accurate timeline. Most of the surviving Hebrew and Greek manuscripts of the Old Testament are from the medieval period. It's the same for the Hebrew manuscripts and the Greek manuscripts. Most of them are from the Middle Ages. However, let's also discuss the oldest surviving fragments. The oldest surviving fragments of the Greek Septuagint are from the 2nd century BCE, which is very early and impressive, right? But the oldest surviving Hebrew manuscript fragments are somewhat older and trace back to the 3rd century BCE. So even the oldest surviving manuscript fragments are in Hebrew, not to mention the Ketef Hinnom scrolls from the 7th century BCE that contain a quote from the Hebrew Torah in Hebrew. So by all means, the Hebrew Bible is much older than the Greek Bible. Now, the Greek Septuagint as a translation from Hebrew typically gives the same message and the same meaning, just in a totally different language. However, no translator is perfect, and therefore no translation is perfect. And the Greek Septuagint is no exception to the rule. Some people think the Septuagint was divinely inspired and it contains no mistakes. So let's start by studying one example of a mistranslation in the Greek Septuagint version of the Bible. And I selected this particular example from Genesis chapter 27 verse 5 because I've seen in real life how easy it is for someone to mistranslate this particular word in this particular context and passage exactly like the Septuagint translators did. So let's start by reading the Hebrew text. It says, Vayelech Esau hasadeh, so Esau went into the field, latzud tzayid, to hunt game, lehavi. So this word in the blue box, lehavi, is the important word. It's a verb in Hebrew and it means to bring. He went to hunt game to bring. However, in context, we know that his father Isaac or Yitzchak sent him to do this. Okay, so now let's read the Greek translation of this phrase. In Greek, it says, Εποριούθαι de Esau, so Esau went, στο πεδίον, into the field, theirusai theiran, to hunt game. So everything so far is exactly the same in the Hebrew Bible and in the Greek Bible. It's just two different languages. But now, pay attention to the words in the red box because they correspond to the Hebrew word in the blue box, but it's not the same. So in Greek, instead of saying to bring, it says to patri autou, which means for his father. So in Hebrew, we have a verb. In Greek, we have a definite article, a noun, and a personal pronoun. It's completely different. Now, in context, it doesn't make a difference because we know in context he did this for his father. But in terms of translational accuracy, this is a big difference. So now the big question is which version is correct and which version is wrong. And it's obvious in this example that the Hebrew version is correct and that someone misread the Hebrew text, because in Hebrew, the verb to bring and the word for his father look very similar. So here in the red box at the top, I copied the Hebrew word meaning for his father, and now you can compare these two words in Hebrew. They both begin with a lamed and a schwa, followed by a guttural letter with a kametz, even though the one is with a hey, the other is with an aleph. It's pretty similar, le a or le ha, and then both have the soft bait and the chilek yod, the V sound towards the end. So these two words, le aviu at the top and le havi at the bottom, look very similar in Hebrew, and they even sound very similar in Hebrew. Now, if you try to read the Hebrew Bible like you would read the Bible in English, without checking the spelling of every single word and without checking the sequence of all the letters, it's very easy to misrecognize this word. You just recognize it at first sight, but you misrecognize it and you think it says for his father because that's what you anticipate to read. In context, his father sent him, so now you anticipate to read he did this for his father, and then you see a word that looks pretty much like the Hebrew word meaning for his father, and you think that's what you read. And like I said, I've seen in real life how easy it is to make this mistake. Someone who was becoming familiar enough with the Hebrew Bible to just recognize the words thought that this said he went to hunt game for his father, and he translated it that way because he anticipated to see the word le'aviu, and the word looked so similar he thought that's what it said. And that's the exact same mistake that the Septuagint translators made. They completely mistranslated the Hebrew text because they read what they thought it should say, not what's actually written. So very clearly, the Hebrew Masoretic Text is the original, and the Greek Septuagint is a mistranslation where the translators translated what they anticipated to see and they misrecognized this Hebrew word and mistranslated it into Greek. However, if the Greek phrase to patri autou were the original, no one would have mistranslated it because it doesn't even look like the Greek verb meaning to bring. It's very clear that the Hebrew is the original. The Hebrew was misread and mistranslated, but you can't misread or mistranslate the Greek text and come up with this Hebrew verb. So it shows the direction of translation, and it shows us which version is correct and which version is wrong. And interestingly, there are similar examples of mistranslation in the Greek version of the book of Revelation. We have a separate video on that topic if you are interested, where we show several examples where the translator misread the Hebrew text and mistranslated it into Greek, but you cannot misread the Greek text because the two words don't look similar in Greek. So that's just one example. The Septuagint contains numerous examples of mistranslations between the Hebrew and the Greek, and clearly this is not divine inspiration. This is human translation and all humans make mistakes. So let's get back to the topic for today, which is the numbers or amounts in the Greek Bible versus the Hebrew Bible. We already saw this quote, and it is true that there is more than 1,000 years difference between the chronology of the Hebrew Bible and the chronology of the Greek Bible. The big question is, who corrupted the text and which version should we follow? Because as you will see, these are not accidental scribal mistakes and accidental mistranslations. No, someone with a plan and a purpose corrupted the chronology on purpose. The only question is, who did it? So let's also have a look at a short video clip by Dr. Henry Smith, and he is one of the greatest proponents of the Septuagint chronology among Bible believers, and I want you to notice his overall viewpoint, but also the disclaimer that he makes at the end of this short video clip.
My view is that the Septuagint largely preserves the original text, the original numbers, and the original chronology, with a couple of exceptions. My view is that the Septuagint largely preserves the original text, the original numbers, and the original chronology, with a couple of exceptions.
So it's interesting that even Dr. Smith has to include a disclaimer saying there are a couple of exceptions in which the Septuagint is clearly wrong and the Masoretic text is clearly correct. And today we will study one of these so-called exceptions that actually point in the other direction altogether. Now, I also want to show you that this tradition, which says that the Hebrew Bible is corrupt in its chronology and the Greek Bible is correct in its chronology, is a very ancient tradition that traces back to the time of the so-called church father Augustine. And he recorded, that is, some people believe that the Jewish manuscripts, rather than our own, are in error. Now, this is kind of ironic because originally the Septuagint was translated by Hellenistic Jews. However, when the church fathers refer to the Jewish manuscripts, they mean the Hebrew manuscripts. When they say our own manuscripts, they're referring to the Septuagint, the Greek Bible used by the Greek church. Okay? So let's read further. For they do not admit that this is a mistake of the translators, but maintain that there is a falsified statement in the original. That's quite incredible. The original is corrupt, the translation is correct. And by the way, they are discussing the chronology of Genesis chapter 5. So that's the whole context, the amounts in the chronology in Genesis chapter 5. These people say it is not credible that the 70 translators who simultaneously and unanimously produced one rendering could have erred or could have falsified their translation, but that the Jews have made alterations in their text. So first of all, this does not make any sense to say that the translators cannot make mistakes, but the Jewish scribes corrupted everything. Remember, the Jewish scribes simply have to copy every word into the new manuscript. The Greek translators had to change every single word into a different language. So who's more likely to make mistakes? And by the way, this tradition which says that 70 translators translated the entire Bible from Hebrew into Greek in 70 days without making any mistakes, and their parallel translations showed no discrepancies, and afterwards they never changed the Septuagint, is one gigantic fairy tale. It never happened. The Septuagint contains many mistakes just like any other translation. Now, let's have a look at some of the actual differences and discrepancies in Genesis chapter 5. Now, you don't have to remember or keep track of all these numbers, but we're just going to focus on the differences, and later I'll also show you a timeline and a summary of the whole issue. So based on the Hebrew Masoretic Text, Seth was 105 years old when his son Enos was born. But based on the Greek Bible, he was 205 years old when his son Enos was born. So it's a 100-year difference. It's a huge difference. Based on the Hebrew Bible, Enos, or Enosh, was 90 years old when he had a son, but based on the Greek Bible, he was 190 years old when he had a son. And so in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 generations only, there's a 500-year discrepancy between the chronology of the Hebrew Bible and the chronology of the Greek Bible. So this is a huge difference, and it affects every aspect of biblical chronology. How much time lapsed between creation and the flood, how much time lapsed between creation and Yeshua's first coming, etc., etc. All of this is affected by the chronology in the book of Genesis. Now, as you can see, it's interesting that 105 became 205. Even the 5 stayed the same, but a round number was changed. And the same with 65 versus 165. And now let's also have a look at Methuselah. Based on the Hebrew Bible, Methuselah was 187 years old when he had a son, but based on the Greek Bible, he was 167 years old when he had a son. So again, the 7 stayed the same, but there's a 20-year difference between these two versions. So it's the same technique that they used all throughout. A round number was either added or subtracted, depending on which version is the original, but the small detailed numbers even stayed the same. And interestingly, most of these people have the same age at death, both in the Hebrew Bible and in the Greek Bible. So for example, Methuselah died at age 969. It's the same in the Hebrew Bible and in the Greek Bible. So that means that a second number was also changed. They can't just change Methuselah's age at which he had a son without changing the amount of time that he lived afterwards. So 2 numbers were changed to make sure that the math adds up. So it's not the lifespan that was changed, but the amount of time between the generations was changed, either in the Hebrew Bible or in the Greek Bible. Now, Lamech is maybe a special case because he died at a different age in the Hebrew Bible versus the Greek Bible. But most of the others have the same age at death. In the Hebrew Bible and Greek Bible, 2 amounts were changed to make sure that the math adds up. So it's a very clever trick that someone did, so you can't immediately see which version is falsified. So now, who corrupted the text and which version of the Bible should we follow? We are warned many times in the Bible not to add or subtract or corrupt Elohim's word. For example, Proverbs 30 verse 6, "Do not add to his words, lest he reproves you and you be found a liar." Well, someone either added or subtracted from the biblical chronology, and that corrupt version of the Bible is no longer the truth. So it's very important for us to know which version can be trusted. And interestingly, we can show from the biblical narrative itself which version is correct and which version has been corrupted. How are we going to do that? We need to answer the question, how old was Methuselah when the flood came? And once we have answered that question, you will see very clearly that one of the 2 versions does not line up with the biblical narrative of the flood. So, to get the answer, how old was Methuselah when the flood came, is pretty straightforward. We need to take Methuselah's age when he had a son, plus the age of Methuselah's son Lamech when he had a son, plus the age of Lamech's son Noah when the flood came. So in the Hebrew Bible, that's 187 plus 182 plus 600, and the total is 969. And remember, that's the age at which Methuselah died. So in the Hebrew Bible, Methuselah died the same year that the flood came. And that's very significant because Methuselah's name in Hebrew is formed from 2 words, mut, which means to die, and the root word shalach, which means to send. So his name could mean his death will send or his death will bring. So it seems in the Hebrew Bible that Methuselah had a prophetic name and the flood came the exact same year that Methuselah died. So that's interesting. Now let's do the calculation based on the Greek Bible. In the Greek Bible, it says Methuselah was 167 years old when he had a son. His son Lamech was 188 years old when he had a son, and his son Noah was 600 years old when the flood came. If we add up 167 plus 188 plus 600, the total is 955. So based on the Greek Bible, Methuselah was 955 years old when the flood came. However, based on the same Greek Bible, Methuselah continued to live after that, and he only died at age 969. In other words, based on the Greek Bible, Methuselah survived the flood, outlived the flood, and continued living afterwards for about 14 years. And that's a very big issue, isn't it? So let's also put this on a timeline to make it clear. Methuselah's total age at death, based on the Hebrew Bible and the Greek Bible, they agree that he was 969 years old when he died. Now, according to the Hebrew Bible, this was the same year that the flood came. If we take Methuselah's age when he had a son, plus Lamech's age when he had a son, and Noah's age when the flood came, in the Hebrew Bible it's the same year that Methuselah died. However, in the Greek Bible, remember, Methuselah had a son 20 years earlier, and Lamech had a son a few years later, and the total is 14 years earlier than in the Hebrew Bible. So based on the Greek Bible, the flood came when Methuselah was 955 years old, 14 years before his death. And this creates a huge problem, because it creates the impression that the biblical narrative of the flood is maybe an ancient myth or fable, because somehow Methuselah survived the flood based on the Greek Septuagint. Actually, the Bible tells us very clearly who survived the flood. You can see this in the New Testament and in the Old Testament. Only 8 people survived the flood. Only Noah and his wife and his 3 sons and each of their wives. The total is 8. So let's read from 1 Peter. The ark in which a few, that is, 8 persons, were brought safely through the water. And 2 Peter chapter 2, he did not spare the ancient world, but preserved Noah, a preacher of righteousness, with 7 others when he brought a flood upon the world of the ungodly. And we know very well from the Old Testament that Methuselah was not one of these 8 people. Let's read from Genesis chapter 7. On this very day, Noah and Shem and Ham and Japheth, the sons of Noah, and Noah's wife, and the 3 wives of his sons with them, entered the ark, and Yahweh closed it behind him. And all flesh that moved on the earth died, that is, birds and cattle and beasts, and every swarming thing that swarms upon the earth, as well as all mankind. So Methuselah is not one of those that survived the flood. Yet, based on the Septuagint, Methuselah did survive the flood, and he continued living about 14 years after the flood came. And this is a very big issue. And by the way, if you are not familiar with this topic, you might want to do some research on evidence for a worldwide flood. The whole earth is covered with evidence for a worldwide flood. Just as an example, across the world, we find marine fossils on mountaintops. Just as the Bible says, the mountains were under water. Now remember, the Bible also tells us that during and after the flood, mountains rose up and valleys sank down. So it's not that the water level had to rise above Mount Everest, but rather Mount Everest was under water. And to this day, there's plenty of evidence to prove that. So you don't even need the Bible to know that there was indeed a literal worldwide flood. However, the Bible tells us exactly why this happened, how it happened, and when it happened. And whenever we see evidence of the flood, it's supposed to remind us of 2 things. Number 1, Elohim's justice, because Elohim brought the flood to destroy the whole world because of people's wickedness and rebellion. And number 2, the flood should remind us of Elohim's mercy and ability to protect his people, because Noah and his family was preserved through the flood, unharmed. But Satan doesn't want us to know or believe any of that. He wants to make the biblical narrative of the flood an ancient fable. And unfortunately, the Septuagint falls in the same category because it implies that the biblical narrative of the flood is some sort of a myth or a fable. It never really happened because Methuselah survived the flood. And this is a very serious issue for anyone who believes that the Bible is true and trustworthy. So now let's go back to a video clip of Dr. Smith, because of course he knows about this problem in the Septuagint. So let's see how a Bible believer defends the Septuagint chronology when it comes to Methuselah, who outlived the flood based on the Greek Septuagint.
Now it turns out, so I used to read that years ago, Doug. And I would dismiss the Septuagint because in all the creationist literature, it would say, Methuselah lived through the flood, you can't trust the Septuagint. And I dismissed it along with everybody else until my friend Jeremy pressed me very hard on this issue and said, you need to go research this. So I said, okay, that's what I'm going to do. And it turns out, so the issue is his begetting age is different than in the Masoretic text.
Right.
But it turned out that it's only in some manuscripts of the Septuagint, not all manuscripts. Okay? Some read 167, which puts him living through the flood, and some read 187, which has him dying before the flood. Okay?
Okay.
And the 187 is the number in the Masoretic text. And I think that number is the original number, reflected in the Masoretic, reflected in some manuscripts of the Septuagint.
So basically, Dr. Smith's argument is that the original Septuagint was correct, and it's only some manuscripts of the Septuagint that have Methuselah living through the flood, and obviously those manuscripts are wrong. But the original Septuagint was correct. Now, is this really a possible explanation? Methuselah's age, where he lives through the flood, could that be an unintentional mistake? Or is this also a purposeful corruption? Because remember, two numbers were changed. So in the Hebrew Masoretic Text, Methuselah had a son when he was 187 years old, and he lived 782 years after that. So by the way, Dr. Smith's claim, some manuscripts have him living through the flood, some manuscripts have Methuselah dying before the flood. It's not accurate because nearly all manuscripts of the Septuagint say that Methuselah was 167 years old when he had a son, and he lived 802 years after that. That's what the greatest majority of Septuagint manuscripts say. So two numbers were changed in perfect harmony to make sure that the math adds up for his total age of 969. And then the handful of Septuagint manuscripts that agree with the Hebrew Bible again have two numbers that differ from the other Septuagint manuscripts. So it's not as if someone could accidentally make one mistake and that creates this big issue. Someone with a plan and a purpose intentionally changed two numbers. Okay? And before we continue with this discussion, I also want to show you that even Dr. Smith acknowledges that when you see two numbers that were changed to make sure that the math adds up, we know that it's an intentional corruption and not an accidental scribal mistake.
So this appears to be something systematic that occurred, not just errors or things like that.
No, it's impossible for it to be scribal errors. It's too systematic. It's too widespread. And you got to change multiple numbers. You got to change the remaining years too, especially in Genesis 5, because the math has to add up for the lifespan.
Right.
So if you change a begetting age, then you got to change the remaining years, and those both can't be scribal errors. You got to do all that.
So Dr. Smith knows very well, and it's just common sense, that when two numbers were changed to make sure that the math adds up, it's not a scribal mistake, it's not an accidental change, it's a purposeful change. And doesn't it make sense to say that the same group of people who changed all those other amounts with the same technique, where a round number was added or subtracted. They applied the same technique to Methuselah's age. So the bottom line is that someone intentionally changed Methuselah's numbers, his ages, just as we saw in those other generations. This is not an accidental scribal mistake. But Dr. Smith, in his attempt to justify the Septuagint, he now turns against his own principle, saying it cannot be a scribal mistake. Now, all of a sudden, this has to be some sort of a scribal mistake, and the original Septuagint was correct. Now, the question remains, why do some manuscripts of the Septuagint agree with the Hebrew Bible, while most of the Septuagint manuscripts disagree with the Hebrew Bible? How do we know whether the original Septuagint had Methuselah living through the flood, or whether the original Septuagint simply agreed with the Hebrew Bible? And the answer is pretty simple. If the original Septuagint did not have Methuselah living through the flood, if the original Septuagint agreed with the Masoretic Text in both these numbers, no scribal mistake could have resulted in Methuselah living through the flood. Okay? But if the original Septuagint was corrupted in all those generations, including Methuselah, and this was done on purpose, someone with a plan and a purpose changed two amounts here, and Methuselah now lives through the flood, supposedly, then copyists of the Septuagint would naturally find the mistake. Now, if you find a mistake in a translation, what's the logical thing to do? You go back to the original language and correct the mistake. And that's what happened in a handful of Septuagint manuscripts. The scribes found the mistake. They realized this cannot be true. Methuselah living through the flood, that's impossible. So we better go back to the Hebrew Bible, find the correct numbers, and substitute the Hebrew numbers in the Greek Bible. And the big problem is you cannot take a corrected version of the Septuagint and claim that is the original Septuagint. A practical example would be if someone takes the King James Version of the Bible and starts making corrections. For example, they cross out L-O-R-D in capital letters and they write in Y-H-W-H or Yod-Hey-Waw-Hey, the Creator's name. The corrected version of the Septuagint is obviously going to be more accurate and closer to the original Hebrew. But you cannot take a corrected version of the Septuagint or a corrected version of the King James Bible and say, this is the original. This is the original King James Bible was correct. Because someone simply corrected it afterwards. Now let's also have a look at some quotes, because it's very well known to experts in the Hebrew Bible and the Greek Bible that the Septuagint was later corrected towards the Hebrew. And if you want to know what the original Septuagint said, you must distinguish between original readings versus corrections towards the Hebrew. So this is from Professor Tov's book, The Text Critical Use of the Septuagint in Biblical Research. And right at the start of his book, he has some abbreviations, and one of them is LXX with an asterisk. That means the original text of the Septuagint, of the LXX, opposed to later revisions correcting the translation towards the Proto-Masoretic text. So this is one of the most basic things you need to do when you compare various manuscripts of the Septuagint and they differ. You need to distinguish between original readings of the Septuagint versus corrections towards the Hebrew. Because if a manuscript is corrected towards the Hebrew, it looks more correct, but it's no longer the original Septuagint, it's just a correction. And let's study a practical example where we can see a correction towards the Hebrew in some manuscripts of the Septuagint. So on the screen at the top we have a screenshot from the Hebrew Bible, Genesis chapter 2, and then in the middle we have the Greek Septuagint version, and at the bottom we have a critical apparatus which shows variant readings among different manuscripts of the Greek Septuagint. So let's start by reading the Hebrew. Genesis chapter 2 verse 2 says, Vayechal Elohim bayom hashvi'i, so Elohim completed on the seventh day, melachto asher asa, his work which he did, or his work which he made. Now, this word, Hashavi'i, meaning the seventh, is very confusing if you read it, because didn't Elohim create everything in 6 days? There are other passages in the Bible that state very clearly Elohim created everything in the heavens and in the earth in 6 days. Now it says Elohim completed or finished his work on the 7th day. And because that doesn't quite make sense, people want to change it into something that does make sense. So let's read the Septuagint translation of this verse. In Greek it says, Kai sinetele ho theos, so theos, or Elohim or God, completed en te hemera, in the day, te hexte, the 6th. Elohim completed in the 6th day, ta erga autu, his works, ha epoesen, which he had made. So in the Greek Septuagint, instead of saying Elohim completed his work on the 7th day, it says Elohim completed his work on the 6th day, which seems to make more sense. Now, which version is the original? And it's interesting that in this example, again, a number was changed. Now, many people bring up the argument of the more difficult reading, and they say there's a principle in textual criticism which says the more difficult reading is the original. However, you need to realize that that is only valid if the more difficult reading can be justified or can make sense. You cannot take a silly scribal mistake which doesn't make any sense whatsoever and say that's the more difficult reading, that's the original. So clearly the Hebrew is the more difficult reading, but can we justify it? Did Elohim do something on the 7th day? Well, in context, what did Elohim do? On the 7th day, Elohim rested from his work, and Elohim set the 7th day apart, and Elohim blessed the 7th day on the 7th day. So yes, Elohim created everything in 6 days, but the Sabbath day was not yet instituted. On the 7th day, Elohim completed or perfected his work by setting the 7th day apart and making it a blessed day. He blessed the 7th day and set it apart on the 7th day. So clearly the Hebrew reading is correct. You just need to read it in context, because Elohim did not create anything on the 7th day, but he instituted the Sabbath day on the 7th day. And the Greek Septuagint is obviously just a simplified translation where someone tried to make sense out of it without fully understanding the context. Now, let's also have a look at the critical apparatus, because there are some Greek manuscripts that say the 7th day. So first of all, in the critical apparatus, it says te hexte, the 6th, and they say it's the same as in the Samaritan Pentateuch. Now that's also interesting, because it could indicate that the Septuagint was translated from an edited and corrupt version of the Torah, similar to the Samaritan Pentateuch, but it could also be that the Samaritan editors of the Torah simply applied the same logic and said it doesn't make sense, Elohim created everything in 6 days, so we better change it so it won't confuse our readers. But then, let's read further. There are some Greek manuscripts that read hebdome, meaning 7th, instead of hexte, meaning 6th. So there are some Greek manuscripts that read Elohim completed his work on the 7th day, te hebdome, in Greek. And they have a list of such Greek manuscripts of the Septuagint. Now, if the Hebrew reading is clearly the original, and the 7th is clearly correct and original, why don't they put that word in the main text? The world's top scholars in the Greek Septuagint, when they publish a critical edition of the Greek Septuagint, in the main text it says the 6th day, not the 7th day. Why is that? It's because they know very well that Septuagint copyists would find these discrepancies and correct the Septuagint towards the Proto-Masoretic Text, towards the Hebrew Bible. So it's obvious to them that the original Septuagint said the 6th day. Later, copyists found the mistake and started correcting it towards the Hebrew. And the point is, you cannot take these corrected manuscripts and say the original Septuagint was correct. But that is exactly what Dr. Smith does with Methuselah's ages. He looks at the handful of manuscripts that were corrected towards the Hebrew Bible, and then he says the original Septuagint was correct. No, the original Septuagint was wrong. But a handful of the manuscripts were corrected by the copyists to bring them into harmony with the Hebrew Bible. Let's read this second quote by Professor Tove, where he says, "A multitude of textual traditions resulted from the insertion of corrections mainly towards the Hebrew in all known individual scrolls." And that's why modern editions of the Septuagint are not based on one single manuscript, because all the individual Septuagint manuscripts contain corrections away from the Septuagint towards the Hebrew in various different places. So they take a collection of important manuscripts and they select the non-harmonized original Septuagint readings for their critical edition of the Greek Septuagint. And the corrections towards the Hebrew just go in a footnote at the bottom of the page, because that's not what the original Septuagint said. But let's read further. Later on, there was the creation of new textual groups and the contamination of existing ones through the influence of the text of the revisions of Origen and Lucian in the 3rd and 4th centuries CE. And they also attempted to bring the Greek Bible into closer harmony with the Hebrew Bible. So, right from the start, when the Greek Septuagint was translated, it was full of mistakes and discrepancies compared to the Hebrew Bible, and right from the start, people who noticed these discrepancies started correcting the Septuagint towards the Hebrew. But you cannot take a corrected manuscript of the Septuagint and say that is the original, because it's not the original Septuagint. Let's have a look at one more practical example of a correction in the Septuagint towards the Hebrew Masoretic Text. And this example is from Deuteronomy chapter 32. It's one of the well-known differences between the Hebrew Bible and the Greek Bible. In Hebrew, it says, "Lemispar b'nei Yisrael," to or by the number of the children of Israel, literally the sons of Israel. That's what it says in the Hebrew Bible. What does it say in the Greek Septuagint? It says, "Kata arithmon," according to the number, "angelon theou," of the angels of Theos, or the angels of God. So many people think this is a massive difference. The Hebrew says sons of Israel, the Greek says angels of God, angels of Theos. So how did this difference come about? Well, it's well known that the Greek Septuagint translators would render B'nai Elim, or B'nai Elohim, or B'nai El, and similar phrases as angels of Elohim instead of sons. They interpret it, when it's sons of Elohim, it means angels of Elohim. Okay? Now, if you look at the word Yisrael, it has the word El at the end, which means the same as Elohim. So the Septuagint basically translates Lemispar b'nei El instead of Lemispar b'nei Yisrael. It's a difference, but you can see how this difference came about. And then in translation, it sounds completely different. Now, of course, since ancient times, people would realize that there is a difference, there's a discrepancy in these two versions, and sometimes they would correct the Septuagint towards the Hebrew. And in this particular manuscript, someone wrote in the margin, in Greek, so the word at the top is we own, sons, instead of angels, and then underneath it we have an abbreviation with iota, alpha, and lambda, and a line above it, so it's clearly an abbreviation for Israel in Greek. So someone found the mistake in the Greek Septuagint, corrected it in the margin towards the Hebrew, and they replaced angels of Theos with sons of Israel. Now, very often when scribes copy an older manuscript, they tend to copy the corrections instead of the mistakes. It just makes sense, because if a proofreader finds mistakes and they correct the mistakes in the margin and you want to write a new manuscript, why would you follow the mistakes if you can follow the corrections, right? And in this way, corrections like these, corrections towards the Hebrew, ended up in the main text of the next generation of manuscripts. and those manuscripts then contain corrections towards the Hebrew in the main text. It's no longer in the margin, and still it's not the original Septuagint. You cannot take this correction towards the Hebrew and say, look, that's the original Septuagint. The original Septuagint was correct. No, the exact opposite. The original Septuagint was wrong. Someone found the mistake and corrected it in a handful of manuscripts. Now that you understand this principle, let's go back to Methuselah's ages. Nearly all manuscripts of the Septuagint say that Methuselah had a son at age 167 and he lived 802 years after that, and that means that Methuselah survived the flood. And that is the reading found in nearly all manuscripts of the Septuagint. But in a handful of manuscripts of the Greek Septuagint, the scribes or copyists recognized the mistake. They recognized the Septuagint is wrong, and they corrected it towards the Hebrew. Can you see here? 187 and 782 is an exact match for the Hebrew. This is not an alternative reading in the Septuagint. This is 100% a correction towards the Hebrew. They did not simply add enough years to make sure that Methuselah died before the flood or something like that. They copied the Hebrew Masoretic Text exactly. So very clearly, the original Septuagint had Methuselah living through the flood. Some copyists found the mistake and corrected it towards the Hebrew. Now, keep in mind, if the original Septuagint was correct, as Dr. Smith insists, if the original Septuagint said 187 and 782, why in the world do most Septuagint manuscripts say 167 plus 802? It's not a correction towards the Hebrew. It's not a correction towards the Samaritan Pentateuch. It's not a correction to try and make sense out of anything. If the original Septuagint was correct, why would most manuscripts end up being corrupt? No, we see that the original Septuagint was wrong. Remember, this is the same technique that was used in all those other generations that we saw earlier today, where a round number was either added or subtracted in two amounts to make sure that the math adds up. It's the same technique that was used for this corrupt reading regarding Methuselah's age. So it's very clear that the original Septuagint had Methuselah living through the flood. Some scribes found the mistake and corrected it towards the Hebrew. And the big mistake that Dr. Smith makes is to say that these manuscripts that were corrected towards the Hebrew preserve the original Septuagint. No, it's the exact opposite. You cannot take a corrected King James Version Bible and say the original King James Version was correct because some people started correcting their Bibles. It doesn't even make sense whatsoever. So, to sum up, the Hebrew Masoretic Text and Greek Septuagint show huge discrepancies with regards to numbers or amounts, especially in the genealogies in the book of Genesis. The Hebrew Masoretic Text is consistent with the biblical narrative. Methuselah died the same year that the flood came. His name is even prophetic. However, in the Greek Septuagint, it indicates that Methuselah outlived the flood by about 14 years. And therefore, we can conclude that the Greek Septuagint has been corrupted in its chronology, not the Hebrew Bible. The Greek Septuagint is corrupt because it implies that the biblical narrative of the flood is just a myth or a fable. And it's not. It's literal reality. It really happened. And if you just read it in Hebrew, there's no contradiction after all. And remember, don't fall for that silly excuse which says Methuselah's age is just a mistake in some manuscripts of the Septuagint. It's not. It's a purposeful change, just as in all those other generations where a round number is added or subtracted 2 times to make sure that the math adds up. I hope you found this interesting, and until next time, Shalom in Yeshua Mashiach.